before we get to how can we protect people, how can people protect themselves? How can you get the parasite out of yourself?
That's a great question. So so anything that I'm going to say in answering that question, how do we inoculate ourselves against this? How do we vaccinate ourselves against this? If we're already parasitized, how do we cure ourselves? That rests on one single, a priori tenet, and that is that you are at least open to my evidence, right? So if you just go la 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 my ears and I'm not going to listen, then you're impenetrable. There's no way for me. It's kind of like saying you'd like to benefit from the vaccine, but you're too scared of the needle, and therefore I can't give you.
Great analogy.
I can't. Right. So once we agree that you are open to the vaccine, then here is how. There are several things that we can do, but let me discuss the biggest one. So there is a thing in chapter 7 of my book, which I call nomological networks of cumulative evidence. Now, this originally comes from my work in evolutionary psychology, actually, which I now apply to this context. So nomological networks of cumulative evidence is the idea that if I'm trying to convince you of an explanation, let's say a scientific explanation, I have to start thinking this way. What would be the data that I would need to show you that becomes so unassailable that even the most dogged detractor will be drowned in a sea of evidence, right? Now, as someone, you're in Britain, correct?
Correct.
Right. So Charles Darwin, if you'd like, is perhaps the most famous example of someone who was thinking synthetically in this way. Synthetically meaning putting a whole bunch of stuff together, creating consilience, unity of knowledge. Now, he didn't use the term nomological networks of cumulative evidence, but that's exactly what he was doing, because in demonstrating that his theory of natural selection was veridical, was correct, what did he do? He assiduously, over many decades, collected data from an incredible number of sources, from paleontology, from animal husbandry, from embryology, from comparative anatomy, from geology. And each of these small pieces of the puzzle, once you put the whole thing together, made it impossible for you to argue against it, despite the fact that 150 years later, people are still trying to falsify it without being able to, right? And so I take this mindset and I formalize it in this thing called nomological networks of cumulative evidence. Maybe if I give you a specific example, it will help explain. Okay. So let's suppose I want to prove to you that toy preferences are not due to social construction. In other words, it's not just mommy and daddy are sexist pigs and they teach little Johnny to play with the truck and little Linda to play, with the doll, right? In other words, there is something beyond the social constructivist argument. How would I go about demonstrating this to you? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, can I get data from different cultures, different time periods, different paradigms, different disciplines, different methodologies, all of which point to the same incontrovertible final conclusion? Well, so I'll just do a few, okay? Well, I can look at children who are in the pre-socialization stage of their cognitive development, meaning they're too young to have been socialized. They're 3 months old, they're 6 months old, and I could study their sex-specific toy preferences. Now, you might say, well, how would you elicit their preference? They can't speak yet. They're 3 or 6 months old. Well, you can do it through eye gaze. You could do it through what do they go towards? And what you show is that children who are in the pre-socialization cognitive developmental stage are already exhibiting the sex-specific toy preferences that we then see in later children. Now, if I already stopped there, I'm already giving you evidence that is slowly making the nail in the coffin, but I'm going to give you a lot more, okay? If you take little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is an endocrinological disorder that masculinizes their morphology and masculinizes their behavior. So little girls who suffer from this disorder are more boy-like. And we take this group of little girls and look at their toy preferences. What do you think happens to their toy preferences? They are reversed. They're exactly like those of boys. So now I've given you 2 data sets. I've given you data sets from developmental psychology, and I've now given you data from pediatrics, from pediatric endocrinology. Now already the social constructivist thing should be in the dustbin of bullshit history, right? But let's go on. I could look at other species, vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, chimpanzees, to see whether the infants in those species exhibit the same sex specificity and toy preferences. And guess what, my man? They do. Well, you'd have to argue that mama vervet monkey and papa vervet monkey are prone to the same patriarchal sexist influences that we see in humans, right? So now I've given you, if you like, 3 boxes of the nomological network. Bit by bit, I will drown you in evidence so that it becomes very difficult for you to stick to your position. So what I try to then argue to people, that epistemology that I just described need not only apply to scientific arguments or to evolutionary-based arguments. It could apply to any phenomenon that has a lot of contentious debate around it. So the example that I give in the book, the sort of the final example in chapter 7 is Islam a peaceful religion or not? Now, I don't need to get into hysteria. I don't need to listen to noble prophet Barack Obama tell me that it is peaceful or not. I simply need to build a nomological network. And if that nomological network says that Islam is peaceful, then we've proven that it's peaceful. If it says otherwise, then we've proven otherwise. So I don't need hysteria. I don't need emotionality. I don't need to trigger my affective system. I simply go where the data tells me to go. Does that give you a good sense of how to get vaccinated against BS?
It does. But is that an effort that people have to do individually? So have I got to go and do this literature review where I scour the internet and I look at this stuff, and is that a veritable source, and so on and so forth?
So that's a great question. In a sense, it's a slightly less extreme version of putting my ears in my right, because what you're saying is, okay, even if I'm open to listening to you, do I have the cognitive desire to expand?
More so than that, the effort for me to protect myself potentially from one of these ideas, is that on me to go out and search for this much stuff, or is there some platform, or there's some particular voices? Have you got a playbook?
Yes. So one of the projects that I'm currently working on, and I just published an academic paper on exactly that. So one of the ideas that I have is to have something akin to a Wikipedia platform where, what is it? This is not a joke. This is real.
I know it's not a joke, but it's funny. I've got a question. I've got a question coming up that this relates to. So I'm going to let you go, and then I'm going to give you the
Sure.
question.
So, but now what I'm going to say is specific only to evolutionary psychology. So it's not to any debate. So one of the things that I find most galling when imbeciles argue against evolutionary psychology. Sorry, I don't mean to say imbeciles. That's not diplomatic. People with a differing opinion, also known as lobotomized idiots.
Morons.
Right. So they will say things like, well, evolutionary psychology, it's pseudoscience. Yeah, you're a moron. The mind didn't come from magic. It didn't arise through a magical cultural process. Culture exists in its form because of biology, not instead of biology. Socialization matters, but socialization is not something in lieu of biology. It's because of biology. So unless you think that everything in our body is due to evolution, short of the organ that most defines our personhood, this thing called the human mind, then there is no such thing as evolutionary psychology is pseudoscience. Now, you can argue that this particular study in evolutionary psychology did not meet the evidentiary threshold that I like for me to be convinced. But that's also true when astrophysicists are deciding whether the universe is expanding or contracting. So the fact that we may debate about specifics in evolutionary theory or evolutionary psychology doesn't imply that the epistemological exercise of evolutionary psychology is false. It's pseudoscience. To say that evolutionary psychology is pseudoscience is like saying chemistry is pseudoscience. There is no other game in town. If you believe that the human mind evolved through material processes, it's not God who put it, there is no other game in town, right? So to come back to the earlier Wikipedia point, so one of the things that I'm trying to do here is to, if you like, counter the most common criticism of evolutionary psychology that comes from fellow academics. And usually it is that evolutionary psychology is just a bunch of fanciful, just so storytelling, right? So I sit around, I put on my sexy Barry White music, I'm smoking a pipe, sipping some cognac, and I just come up with some bullshit pontification as to why men. And as I showed you a few minutes ago, no, when I want to prove to you that toy preferences are sex specific for an evolutionary reason, I actually go through incredible length to do so, much more so than other sciences. So in my attempt to thwart this, I thought, well, if I can get more people to think along the ways of nomological networks and start building these, like a wisdom of the crowd, where we can build together. So if you want to go see what is the current state of cumulative evidence to prove that men have a preference for the hourglass figure, you can go to that Wikipedia of nomological networks and see it.